the jeweled handle of the dagger dug into her palm, so tightly gripped that her knuckles had turned pale. Behind the heavy carved doors of the bridal chamber, the murmur of footsteps faded, leaving only silence and the thundering of her heartbeat. She was 13 years old, barely more than a child, and yet, in just moments, she would be presented as a wife to a man she scarcely knew. Not a prince from some distant court, not even a noble equal to her in birth, but a soldier in his 50s chosen for her by her grandmother, the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. This girl was Princess Kaya Sultan, granddaughter of Kaya Sultan, and what she carried into that room was more than a blade. It was defiance against a system that demanded her body become a treaty, her will erased for the sake of politics. What happened next would scandalize even the hardened palace guards, because Kaya had resolved that she would not go quietly to her fate. It is tempting to imagine princesses in the Ottoman Empire as figures of untouchable privilege, cushioned by silk and luxury, their slightest wish obeyed. And in some ways, that was true. Kaya Sultan outranked everyone in the empire except her father. She had the legal right to demand her husband remain monogamous. She had the right to initiate divorce, an extraordinary power compared to ordinary women of the time. She even had the legal protection to delay consummation until she felt ready. On paper, her position looked unassailable. But paper promises meant little against the reality of her world. The Ottoman dynasty was built on marriages that were never about love and always about control. A princess's body was as much a tool of empire as an army or a fortress. No matter her privileges, she could be ordered into a marriage that served strategy, not her heart. Kaya understood this. Every princess did. From childhood, she would have heard the whispers, "Your beauty is a weapon. Your purity is your family's honor. Your wedding night is not yours, but the empire's." Inside the labyrinth of Topkapi Palace, their paradise was also their prison. Behind lattice screens and guarded corridors lay the legendary harem, its name derived from the word haram, meaning forbidden. The harem was a universe of women and eunuchs, sealed off from the male world. Girls like Kaya grew up in a world saturated with music, poetry, embroidered silks, and perfumed gardens, but utterly devoid of freedom. Imagine it, a princess might live her entire youth without ever speaking to a man outside her family. Her father, the Sultan, was a distant figure who might appear occasionally in formal grandeur but rarely as a parent. The only males with daily presence were eunuchs, castrated guardians who served as both protectors and wardens. Brothers were rivals in a brutal succession system where survival often meant betrayal. Affection was scarce, trust even scarcer. So when marriage came, it was not merely a union, it was a shattering. A girl who had never been alone with a man was suddenly placed in a chamber with one, ordered to yield her body, her silence broken only by vague warnings from older women: be obedient, endure, pray. There was no education for what awaited her beyond veiled hints and cryptic instructions. The psychological shock was devastating. Historical records softened this reality with euphemisms. Chroniclers wrote of marriage alliances, dutiful unions, or joyous celebrations. But beneath the ceremonial pomp, these were nights of terror. Even palace physicians occasionally recorded cases of wedding night injuries, a delicate phrase for trauma inflicted on girls far too young and unprepared for what was expected of them. And still, the paradox remained: Ottoman princesses had a degree of power unmatched by most women of their age. They could command servants, dismiss tutors, manage vast estates. They spoke multiple languages and composed poetry that survived in ornate manuscripts. Yet none of that could shield them from the looming moment when their fate would be sealed behind a bolted door. This contradiction, privileged yet powerless, honored yet exploited, was the heart of their tragedy. Kaya Sultan, as she stood trembling with a dagger in her hand, embodied that contradiction perfectly. She was revered as the Sultan's blood, a living symbol of imperial glory, yet reduced in this moment to an object in a political bargain. The palace itself reinforced the claustrophobia of her life. Topkapi was no airy castle, it was a fortified maze, its courtyards and chambers designed to keep the royal family both exalted and confined. The harem's inner quarters were windowed with lattices so the women could watch ceremonies unseen. The corridors twisted deliberately, ensuring no direct view from one space to another. This architecture spoke of secrecy and surveillance, every step, every whisper, every glance controlled. It is no wonder, then, that stories of fear and resistance survived only in fragments. The Ottomans maintained strict silence on what happened in bridal chambers. Only when something catastrophic occurred, when a princess resisted so openly it could not be concealed, did the truth seep into the chronicles. Kaya Sultan's story is one of those rare breaches of silence. But before we reach that moment of defiance, it is worth pausing to understand the stakes. The Ottoman Empire at this time stretched from the gates of Vienna down to the deserts of Arabia. It was one of the greatest powers the world had ever known. Every marriage, every child born of these unions, was a matter of statecraft. For the dynasty, the personal was inseparable from the political. For the girls themselves, however, it was inseparable from fear. To be led to a bridal chamber at 13, while knowing your body might soon carry the risk of childbirth that could kill you, was not ceremony, it was a sentence. And Kaya Sultan, despite all her jewels and silks, felt it keenly. That night, when the festivities had ended and the golden carriages were put away, she was led to the chamber where Melik Ahmed Pasha waited. The empire expected her obedience. The dynasty demanded her submission. Instead, Kaya had resolved to grip her dagger and face him with the only power she truly possessed, the courage to resist. What she did behind those doors would ripple through the palace for years, whispered in shock among servants, debated in the council halls, and remembered in chronicles with a mixture of admiration and alarm. For in defying her husband, she was not merely protecting her body. She was exposing the fragile balance of a system that cloaked coercion in the silks of ceremony. And yet, Kaya's was not the only story. She was one of many daughters and nieces caught in the same cruel paradox. Some would resist like her, with fury and weapons. Others would resist like her Aunt Fatma, with contracts and negotiations. Still others would surrender quietly, their pain swallowed in silence. But that first night, in that chamber, the story of resistance began with one trembling girl and one hidden blade. For an Ottoman princess, marriage was never a matter of choice, affection, or desire. It was politics disguised as ceremony, duty dressed in bridal silks. The decision rested in the hands of two people, the reigning sultan and, perhaps more decisively, his mother, the formidable Valide Sultan. In a court where whispers shaped destinies and alliances shifted like desert sands, it was the queen mother who often pulled the strings, binding her daughters and granddaughters to men chosen not for love but for their usefulness to the empire. Historians call this the Sultanate of Women, a period in the 16th and 17th centuries when the mothers and consorts of sultans wielded extraordinary influence behind the palace walls. These women could topple viziers, orchestrate wars, and dictate marriages. They were guardians of dynasty and empire alike, and for their daughters, this meant their lives were treated as chess pieces in a game they never agreed to play. Take Kosum Sultan, grandmother to Kaya. To the world, she was the embodiment of imperial power, regent for her sons and grandsons, a woman who bent the machinery of empire to her will. To her granddaughter, she was the one who signed away her freedom. Kaya's desperate pleas not to marry Melik Ahmed Pasha, her cries of terror at the idea of sharing a bed with a man 4 decades her senior, fell on deaf ears. The marriage strengthened political alliances. That was all that mattered. And this was not an isolated case. By the late 15th century, the Ottomans had deliberately turned inward with their marriage policies. Earlier dynasties had given daughters in marriage to foreign rulers, princes from Persia, Anatolia, or even Europe, cementing bonds across borders. But as the empire's power swelled, the fear of foreign entanglements grew. What if a foreign king, married to an Ottoman princess, one day claimed legitimacy to the throne? What if loyalties fractured? The solution was ruthless: keep the princesses at home. Thus was born the policy historians call endogamous marriage. No more foreign alliances. Instead, Ottoman princesses were married exclusively to Ottoman elites, men who owed everything to the Sultan. These were not equals. They were viziers, pashas, and generals who had clawed their way up through the div-serm system, the state's practice of seizing Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and molding them into loyal servants of the empire. Men who began their lives as slaves could rise to extraordinary heights, but always with the shadow of the Sultan's favor looming over them. To bind them even closer, they were given princesses as wives. Imagine the calculation. A man whose entire career depended on obedience to the throne was now tied by blood to the dynasty itself. He was elevated beyond his station, but never independent. His wife, though royal by birth, became the guarantor of his loyalty. It was brilliant politics, and a private nightmare. For the princess, this meant that her husband was rarely a partner. He was a servant of her father, often decades older, hardened by military campaigns, shaped by a life utterly foreign to the silken seclusion of the harem. A girl raised among poetry and latticed windows was thrust into a chamber with a man forged in war. The gulf between them was immeasurable. The age disparities were staggering. It was not unusual for a princess of 12 or 13 to be married to a man in his 50s, sometimes even his 60s. Princess Fatma Sultan, whose life would become one of the most infamous examples, was married 7 times. 7 husbands across decades, starting from her childhood. By the time of her final marriage, she was in her 50s, and her husband was in his 70s. These men passed through the family like political instruments, reused, repurposed, disposed of when no longer convenient. And yet, the paradox deepened. Unlike other women of the empire, princesses did have certain rights. Their marriage contracts contained extraordinary clauses. Any man who married a princess was forbidden from taking another wife. In a world where Islamic law permitted 4 wives, this was unheard of. A princess could also demand divorce at will, walking away from a marriage that displeased her. Most astonishingly, she could legally refuse consummation until she chose otherwise. On parchment, it seemed empowering. But parchment was no shield against pressure. Everyone, from the Sultan to the palace officials, expected the marriage to be sealed. An unconsummated union was worthless, a broken alliance, a risk to stability. So while the law gave the princess the right to refuse, the empire gave her no true freedom. She might delay, but she could not escape. The machinery of politics ensured this. These girls, adorned in pearls and guarded by eunuchs, were still pawns in games older and colder than themselves. And the older they grew, the more disposable they became. If one marriage collapsed, another was arranged. If a husband died, whether in battle, in palace intrigue, or by the executioner's bowstring, the princess was remarried swiftly, her life recycled into the next bargain. It is easy to lose sight of the human cost beneath the grandeur of empire. To see marriage as ceremony, alliance as necessity. But behind the feasts and parades were children trembling in bridal chambers, whispering to themselves that they would rather die than face what awaited them. Behind the calligraphy and poetry they mastered as girls was a silence where no one dared explain what would truly happen on that night. And this silence, this crushing ignorance combined with unyielding duty, was its own kind of torture. To be told your whole life that modesty was your highest virtue, only to have it stripped from you in a single night. To know that your body was both your weapon and your prison. This was the paradox the princesses of the Ottoman Empire lived with every day. Kaya Sultan carried her dagger into the chamber as a desperate shield. But she was not alone in her fear. Many others had faced the same terror, though few had the audacity, or perhaps the desperation, to fight back. The empire's records preserve their names as wives and mothers, their lives summarized in lineage and titles. But the truth of what they endured, the private despair of their nights, lingers only in fragments. Soon, in one of the most shocking breaches of silence, Kaya's story would burst into the open. She would not submit. She would not go quietly. Her dagger would find its mark, and for 7 years, she would hold her husband at bay. But before her defiance shook the palace, she was just one girl among many, caught in the machinery of empire where marriage was never love, it was statecraft. The wedding of Kaya Sultan in 1644 was an event that dazzled the city of Istanbul. 4 days, the capital was transformed into a theater of imperial grandeur. Crowds thronged the streets as the young princess was paraded in a gilded carriage, her face hidden behind silken veils. Trumpets blared, coins rained down into eager hands, and feasts spilled across the city. It was spectacle, an empire announcing not just a marriage, but an alliance, a reaffirmation of power. To the people, it was celebration. To Kaya, it was a funeral procession for her freedom. Behind the music and jewels, she was miserable. She had pleaded with her grandmother, Fatma Sultan, and even dared to whisper to her mother that she did not want this union. She had even confessed to a forbidden attraction toward another man, a breach of protocol so unthinkable it might have ruined her reputation entirely. But none of it mattered. Her voice was dismissed, her terror ignored. To the dynasty, her body was a piece on the chessboard, her wishes irrelevant. That night, when the last guests departed and the laughter faded, she was led to the bridal chamber. The air was heavy with incense and rosewater. Lamps flickered against the carved walls. Servants withdrew, leaving her alone with Melik Ahmed Pasha, a man 4 decades older, elevated by marriage to the Sultan's bloodline. He approached her expecting obedience, as so many men before him had expected from their young brides. But Kaya had not walked into that room defenseless. Hidden in her silks was a dagger, its jeweled hilt cool against her hand. As Ahmed Pasha reached for her, she did what no one expected. She struck. The blade tore his flesh, and blood welled under his robes. The mighty Pasha recoiled, stunned, humiliated, wounded by a child he thought powerless. Imagine the silence that followed. The guards outside must have heard the commotion, but none dared to enter. For though Ahmed Pasha was a powerful commander, Kaya was the Sultan's daughter. Her rank shielded her from reprisal in that moment. Ahmed could do nothing but retreat, bleeding and shaken, faced with the unthinkable. His bride had rejected him, and more than that, had injured him. The chronicler Evliya Shalebi, who knew Kaya personally, recorded the incident with awe. He called her a raging lioness, a phrase that conveyed both admiration and warning. Kaya had shown the ferocity of a predator cornered, a young girl transforming fear into violence. In that instant, she shattered the silence that had smothered so many before her. But her defiance did not end with one slash of a dagger. Kaya invoked her rights as an imperial princess. She refused consummation. Not for a night, not for a month, but for 7 years. 7 years in which she and her husband lived as strangers beneath the same roof, their union a hollow shell, whispered about in the palace corridors. Servants gossiped. Eunuchs smirked behind their guarded faces. Everyone knew. The Pasha had been bested by a child bride. This refusal was not just personal. It was political dynamite. A marriage without consummation was a useless alliance. It produced no heirs, cemented no bonds. Ahmed Pasha, for all his wounds, physical and pride alike, had to endure. He could not force her, for she outranked him. He could not appeal to the Sultan without humiliating himself. And so the marriage dragged on in limbo, a constant reminder that even within a system designed to control them, some princesses could seize fragments of power. Still, power had its limits. Kaya was not immune to the relentless weight of family duty. Her grandmother, Fatma Sultan, grew impatient. For Fatma, marriage was not about the happiness of a granddaughter but about the solidity of the empire's alliances. After 7 years, she demanded Kaya submit. The empire needed children to secure blood ties. Defiance could no longer be tolerated. Kaya eventually yielded, but not without extracting concessions from her husband. It is a telling detail. The man who had once approached her with entitlement now had to negotiate with her, to earn what he believed was his by right. This reversal was rare, almost unprecedented, and yet even so, it did not mean victory. Kaya's compliance was not born of love or choice, it was forced by the machinery of dynasty. And then, the old fear returned. From her youth, Kaya had believed in a prophecy, that if she bore a daughter, she would die. Superstitions of this kind were not uncommon in the Ottoman court. Women surrounded by omens and whispers often clung to prophecies as explanations for their fates. For Kaya, the dread gnawed at her as she finally fulfilled her grandmother's demand. In 1659, at only 26 years old, the prophecy came true. After delivering a daughter, Kaya Sultan died from complications in childbirth. The dagger that had once protected her could not shield her from the oldest terror. Women in the harem whispered about death in the birthing chamber. Her life ended not at the blade of an enemy, but in the blood-soaked linens of motherhood. Her story echoes with both triumph and tragedy. For 7 years, she held her ground against a system that devoured girls. She carved a space for herself where none should have existed. Yet in the end, her fate remained the same, her body consumed by duty, her death reduced to a footnote in the chronicles of empire. And yet, Kaya's defiance matters precisely because it was remembered. Many others resisted quietly, their struggles swallowed by silence. Kaya's blade pierced not only her husband's flesh but the veil of secrecy that shrouded the bridal chamber. She showed that even in a gilded cage, a girl could roar like a lioness. But she was not the only one. If Kaya wielded steel and fury, her Aunt Fatma wielded another weapon altogether: wealth, and the cold art of negotiation. Where Kaya struck with violence, Fatma struck with contracts, turning her wedding night into a financial battleground. If Kaya Sultan had met her fate with steel in hand, her Aunt Fatma chose another path. No less daring, but colder, sharper, and in its own way just as defiant. Where Kaya's dagger cut into flesh, Fatma's weapon was ink and coin, wielded with a precision that could bleed a husband dry without ever drawing blood. By the time Fatma Sultan was forced into her 7th marriage, she was no innocent child trembling behind lattice screens. She was in her late 50s, weathered by decades of palace intrigues and personal loss. 6 times she had been wed, 6 times widowed. Some husbands had been executed on orders of her own kin, others dead in war or in disgrace. Each union had been arranged with cold political logic, and each had left her with scars that were less visible but no less real. So when the imperial court decreed in 1662 that she would marry again, this time to the same man who had once been the reluctant husband of her niece Kaya, the weary Melik Ahmed Pasha, Fatma knew exactly what to expect. Love had never entered into her calculations. Marriage, for her, was nothing more than survival, and she intended to survive on her own terms. On their wedding night, the chamber should have been a stage for obedience, for consummation, for the fulfillment of dynastic duty. Instead, Fatma transformed it into a negotiation table. Ahmed Pasha, old and humiliated from the memory of Kaya's rebellion years earlier, expected at least compliance from this union. What he received was a list of demands so audacious it staggered him. Fatma insisted upon an allowance equal to the annual tax revenue of Egypt, the empire's richest province. The figure was obscene, a fortune that could fund armies, build palaces, sustain entire regions. For Ahmed, it was impossible. For Fatma, it was non-negotiable. When he balked, she offered him a choice delivered with ice-cold calm: pay the allowance, or grant her an immediate divorce and return her dowry in full. That dowry, conveniently, was also valued at roughly the same staggering sum, the wealth of a province. In other words, Ahmed was trapped. Divorce her and he would be financially ruined, humiliated before the court. Stay married, and he would bleed money but preserve his position. It was a masterstroke of strategy. Fatma knew the system as intimately as she knew her own reflection in a mirror. She had lived through decades of alliances that rose and fell on financial negotiations, seen men destroyed not by swords but by debts. She turned that knowledge into her shield. Her marriage, unsurprisingly, was no romance. It lasted mere months before Ahmed Pasha's health collapsed. Some chroniclers whispered that it was stress, others that the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by yet another Ottoman princess had eaten away at him like poison. He died, leaving Fatma once more a widow, but not a victim. When his estates were inventoried, Fatma moved quickly, claiming vast properties and wealth before officials could intervene. She declared them compensation for unpaid allowances, a widow's right, even as the Grand Vizier himself had to step in to claw back what she had seized. By then, her reputation was sealed. Fatma Sultan, the princess who turned marriage into a business negotiation so ruthless that even in death her husbands could not escape her grip. What Kaya had done with a dagger in a moment of desperation, Fatma achieved with decades of calculation. Hers was not the defiance of youth but the defiance of experience, a survival instinct honed across years of watching men rise and fall. She had long since abandoned the illusions of romance, or even the faint hope of personal happiness. In her world, to endure was to exploit every ounce of power her birth afforded her. And yet, beneath the ice and the iron, one must wonder, what did it cost her? To measure intimacy only in allowances and estates? To reduce marriage, over and over, to a transaction that she neither wanted nor chose? Perhaps for Fatma, the only way to keep her humanity intact was to transform the system's cruelty into her own armor. Better to bleed her husbands of coin than to let them bleed her of dignity. Her story reveals another side of the Ottoman princess's paradox. Kaya, young and wild, had roared like a lioness and paid with her life. Fatma, older and hardened, learned to roar with numbers and contracts, and she outlived nearly everyone. In both cases, their so-called wedding nights were not unions but battlefields, different weapons, same war. And what is most striking is that these stories are the ones we know. Kaya with her dagger, Fatma with her dowries. Their defiance was too dramatic, too shocking to be buried entirely in silence. But for every Kaya and Fatma, there were countless others whose names remain footnotes, whose terrors played out behind closed doors, unseen and unrecorded. Those women had no daggers, no demands, no chroniclers to immortalize their resistance. They entered their chambers in silence and emerged in silence, their pain buried beneath layers of courtly decorum. And it is to them we must now turn, the majority whose suffering was hidden, whose voices were never heard. For every Kaya who raised a dagger and every Fatma who sharpened her contracts into weapons, there were dozens of princesses whose stories never reached the chronicles. They entered the bridal chamber quietly, endured quietly, and vanished into history without a word. Their silence is the loudest echo of all. The Ottoman court was built upon discretion. What happened behind the carved doors of a wedding chamber was not for public record. Only when a union collapsed spectacularly, when a girl attacked her husband with steel or bankrupted him with financial demands, did the chroniclers dare to hint at what had occurred. The rest was buried under euphemisms: dutiful wife, alliance fulfilled, union celebrated. These phrases concealed a truth too raw to be written. And yet, the fragments that survive allow us to glimpse the cost. Physicians summoned in the aftermath of wedding nights sometimes recorded injuries, delicate words for trauma inflicted on bodies too young, too unready. These reports never blamed coercion, they simply noted that treatment was required. Behind the veils of official silence, there was blood, fear, and pain. The rituals themselves amounted to a kind of psychological torture. Before her wedding, a princess would be bathed, perfumed, her skin softened with oils, her body stripped of hair according to custom. Jewels and silks turned her into a glittering gift. But beneath the finery was a trembling girl, transformed into an object of desire against her will. Some reportedly tried to resist by neglecting the rituals, presenting themselves disheveled, as if ugliness might shield them. But the marriage was not about beauty or desire. It was about politics. No amount of resistance could alter that. The morning after brought its own humiliations. While we lack explicit records of bloody sheets paraded in the Ottoman palace, accounts suggest that senior women of the harem discreetly confirmed whether consummation had taken place. Imagine the terror of knowing that not only your body but its violation might be inspected as evidence of duty fulfilled. For a young girl raised on ideals of chastity and modesty, this reversal must have been unbearable. The fear did not end with the wedding night. To become a bride was also to face the mortal danger of motherhood. Ottoman palaces were filled with whispers of women who died in childbirth, of infants lost within days, of mothers who bled out alone despite the best physicians the empire could provide. These princesses knew the risks. Each step toward the bridal chamber was also a step toward a possible grave. Kaya Sultan's prophecy, that bearing a daughter would bring her death, was not mere superstition. It was the distillation of a very real truth: childbirth killed, and it killed often. Even the bonds that offered comfort carried their own complexities. Eunuchs, the castrated men who guarded the harem, were often the only males the princesses could trust. Some forged deep attachments with these guardians, confiding fears they could share with no one else. Chroniclers whisper of girls clinging to their eunuchs before their weddings, begging them for escape, for protection. But the eunuchs, though sympathetic, were bound by loyalty to the sultan. They could soothe with words but never intervene. Their very presence, both protective and powerless, symbolized the paradox of the harem itself, safety laced with captivity. European ambassadors who glimpsed these marriages from afar noted a strange tension in the air. Venetian envoys described wedding processions where the women of the palace, hidden behind latticed windows, appeared mournful rather than joyful. Outsiders sensed the dissonance. Public celebration masking private despair. Their reports, less constrained by Ottoman conventions of silence, reveal what the empire tried to hide, that beneath the gold and music lay a system that broke its most privileged daughters. The psychological toll was devastating. Court physicians described cases of melancholia, what today we might call depression, trauma, or post-traumatic stress. Some princesses reportedly went mad, their minds splintered under the weight of duty and fear. Others withdrew into religious devotion, cloistering themselves in prayer as a way to escape further marriages. A few, through cunning or circumstance, managed to avoid marriage altogether, dedicating their lives to charity or to serving the sultan in roles too valuable to risk in alliances. But these were rare exceptions. For most, the cage remained. They lived and died as pawns, pampered, adorned, yet traded like property. Their golden palaces were still prisons, their jeweled veils still chains. When Kaya raised her dagger, she was not only defending herself from one man, she was tearing open the fabric of a system that had long thrived on silence. When Fatma demanded the wealth of provinces from her husband, she was mocking the very idea that a marriage could consume her without cost. These were extraordinary acts, remembered because they could not be erased. But they were also reminders of the countless princesses who had neither daggers nor dowries to wield. They remind us that history often preserves the loudest defiance while burying the quietest suffering. Kaya's blade and Fatma's contracts echo through the centuries, but behind them stand legions of forgotten daughters whose voices never escaped the harem walls. And in the end, that may be the cruelest paradox of all. These women were born as the most powerful daughters of the most powerful rulers on earth. Yet in the one matter that defined their lives, the right to their own bodies, they had no choice. They were symbols, treaties, sacrifices wrapped in silk. And though some roared and some calculated, the empire always won. Their stories, scattered like shards of glass across chronicles and whispers, remind us that beneath every empire's glory lies the cost borne by those who had no say. For the Ottoman princesses, their golden cages glittered with jewels, but a cage, however gilded, is still a cage.